Hello, dear students. We are in chapter 3, which is really our first chapter, because remember, the chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the Tirol book are left for your own reading. Okay, so we are now in chapter 3, which is our first chapter, and the chapter is called Outside Financing Capacity. What does that mean? It means that a firm has a certain um, limit, a certain capacity to get financing. And that means that there is the possibility that the firm wants to get more financing, wants to get an additional loan, but it can't for some reason. In the classical world, there's only one reason why that could happen, and that is because the NPV, the net present value of a project, is negative. So that means in the classical world, in the classical financing world, without any frictions, if you have an additional investment project that you want to carry out, and if the NPV, the net present value of that project, is positive, then you can always agree with the potential investors upon some interest rate or on some contracting conditions so that you can also attract the financing, so that you can also get the loan. Okay, but in reality, that's not always the case. There are situations in which firms want to get financing, but they can't. So therefore, there is some financing capacity. This is called credit rationing. So that means that the credit loan size itself is somehow rationed. It can mean that there are potential entrepreneurs or firms that don't get any loans at all, or they get a lower volume of loans than they would actually like to have. And both is called credit rationing. Okay. The important thing is that credit rationing, it has to be an equilibrium phenomenon. And that means that if as an entrepreneur you just try to get a loan at an interest rate where you think it's favorable for you, and then the bank says, no, sorry, I need a higher interest rate, I need a higher loan rate, and then you renegotiate, that's not credit rationing. Only if there is no point upon which you can negotiate. Okay, so what are possible explanations for such credit rationing? One, this is the route that's explored here in our chapter 3 here, and then also chapter 4 and 5, so the next 3 chapters. It's always based on moral hazard problems. Um, okay, and that means if you give a firm too many loans, then maybe the interests of the entrepreneur will deviate from those of the investors. And in that case, the entrepreneur might take decisions that are not in line with the interests of the investors. And to prevent this, investors might say, no, we're not going to grant a higher loan in the first place. Okay, this is uh, what's called moral hazard. And of course, we're going to go into more depth into this direction. And the second explanation is adverse selection. And that we will talk about in our chapter 6 of the Tirol book. Okay, so here in this chapter, we have credit rationing due to moral hazard. Um, and we will explain, or we will show that the net worth plays an important role. And this chapter is going to be fundamental for the rest of the lecture. So here we go. Talk about credit rationing. We first have a fixed investment model, and I think it might be optimal if I just go through the model first and then I explain in more detail how we can put flesh to the bones, how we can interpret this model. You will see for the rest of this course that the models that are presented by Jean Tirole are always very simple, or at least most of the time they are very simple, or always tries to keep them at the most simple level possible. And this is very interesting or important because it means that he doesn't try to make the models as realistic as possible, but he just tries to capture some very interesting traits or features of the model in as few assumptions as he can. So that means from a mathematical perspective, the models that we're going to talk about are very simple, but it also means that the most important work is to try to interpret the models and to see what does it mean in reality. So I propose that we first start with the model itself, and I just give a little bit of interpretation, and then we go through the model again, maybe, and then we check what the assumptions actually mean. Okay, so let's start. We have in the model, or also in the rest of the book, we have an entrepreneur. That's typically in the book, it's a woman. So if I say she, it's going to be the entrepreneur, or sometimes called the insider, because she has more information or more decision rights or whatever it could be. So she's sitting inside the firm, or we talk about her as the borrower. Why? Because she borrows money from the investors. She's the one who needs the money, and she has a project. Nobody else can carry out this project. So this means that she is very smart. She's the only one who can carry out this project. She's not able to sell the project. I mean, this would be otherwise a possibility that one could say, okay, why doesn't she just get a patent on her project and then sell the patent to somebody else? This is not possible here. She's the only one who can carry out the project. Okay. But this project has a problem. It costs some money, and this is a fixed investment size of I. It's just a real number. It cannot be changed. In the real world, of course, one could think of there could be larger or smaller versions of projects. The projects might be scalable, that you start small and then you let them grow or something like this. All of this is not possible here. It's just some fixed investment size I. Why? The answer to this question why is most of the time, well, to keep it as simple as possible. That's the same here. We can later on try to make the model more realistic and more complicated, but for now, let's just start with the most simple version that we can. Okay, this entrepreneur, she has some cash on hand, or it's called the net worth A. A is smaller than I, so that means that there is a financing gap, I minus A. That's the difference that she needs as additional funding in order to get the project started. Okay, so one thing that's also important is that the assets are liquid, so they're cash. They can be used to get the investment started. So it's not something like a house that you might own or old fabric buildings or something like that, or anything else. Not anything that you have to sell first, but something that is already liquid. What happens if the assets are illiquid? So if you cannot sell them right away, if there's a problem or loss in value if you sell them, that we will talk about later. So again, the question, why are they perfectly liquid? To keep everything as simple as possible. So what does the investment project look like? Well, if the project succeeds, you get some income of R, which is of course positive, or if it fails, you get nothing at all. So it's just two possible things that can happen. It's called a dichotomous return distribution because only two things can happen here. Why only two states? Well, because that's the most simple thing. Okay, so let's keep it as simple as possible. Just two states of the world, the good state and the bad state. The probability of success for the entrepreneur is P, but here comes now the moral hazard problem. If the entrepreneur, she, behaves, or we also sometimes say work or exerts effort or does not take any private benefit or something like that, I will probably say work because work rhymes on shirk and the other behavior is called shirk. So it's nice to have a rhyme, work and shirk. So if she works, then the success probability is high, pH. Could even be 100%. And if she shirks or misbehaves or does take a private benefit, then the success probability is smaller. It's PL and only PL, and PL is smaller than pH. Okay, so there is a difference. There is a probability gap, pH minus PL, that's called delta P. Important, Well, it's not so important. It's that the delta P is meant as one variable. So if I write delta P, it does not mean delta times P, but it's just like one thing, delta P. Okay? So you can always imagine a little bracket around this delta P. So, but I'm not going to write this bracket every time because um, otherwise there will be too many brackets. So if the entrepreneur shirks, she will get a private benefit of B. What does it mean, private benefit? It means that, well, it's private benefit. It just means that there's some positive effect of shirking. For example, it could be that working costs a lot of effort. It's hard. You have to get up early in the morning and you get home late in the evening, and you don't see your family anymore, and you can't go on a real holiday, just 3 days, not more than that, because you always have to work for your project. So it's a lot of it's hard for you. It gives you some hardship, and that could cost you some. Well, it's costly, but this is not a real cost that you have to, a monetary cost that you have to pay for, but it's just a non-monetary thing that you have to suffer. Okay, so if you don't do it, if you shirk, if you don't work as hard, you're saving on this suffering. So the less suffering, that's called B. And importantly, this is also non-monetary. So it's not something, this B, that you can pay your investors with if you would like to. It's just something that you feel. Okay. Yeah, well, it could also be something a little bit more real. Like, for example, if you shirk, it could be something like consumption on the job, that you pay for yourself. You buy a nice firm car, corporate car, or a corporate jet, or something like that. So things like that you could also have in mind, but most importantly, just the effort saved by the shirking entrepreneur. That's a very good, very nice interpretation. So what else? The borrower and also the potential lenders are risk neutral. Well, the lenders that we haven't talked about so much yet, they are here in the last bullet point. That there's just a couple of agents that have money in their pockets. There's a large quantity of them, so they have an unlimited amount of money. It's just they're just there. Um, and they behave competitively, so their expected profit is typically zero. So they work under complete perfect competition. Right. Um, so what are the other assumptions? That we don't have any time preference. So that means that in the utility functions of the entrepreneurs and of the investors or the lenders, there is no discount rate or something. So a dollar today is worth the same as a dollar in 1 year time at the end of the period or something. Okay. Why? Well, it's just for notational ease. One could also introduce a discount factor, and then one would get positive interest rates. Um, but we just didn't do it in order to avoid this additional variable. If we were interested in the effect of um, the interest rate on corporate financing problems, then of course we would have to change the model and introduce exactly those variables that we are interested in. And but for now we just keep them out. Okay. Then there is a storage technology. So that means if the lenders, if the investors, they just store their money, it gives them a return of zero. So that also means that the opportunity interest rate is zero. And that means that also in the model, because of the perfect competition, the expected interest rate will be zero. One more important thing is that borrower is protected by limited liability. So if the project fails, he cannot pay. There's nothing he can do. He doesn't have anything. He cannot pay. Okay? Right. And the last bullet point is that the lenders behave competitively. Now, that's a question that we can think about. Is that the case in reality? Do lenders behave competitively? Um, or what is it? How can we interpret this assumption? Well, the interpretation here is that if you're lending, that's something that's somehow exchangeable. Everybody can lend money. You don't need any special skills for that. If you do need special skills, like for example, if there are special lending skills, monitoring skills, or something like that, then the situation changes, and that we're going to discuss later on. But right here, it's the only thing that the lenders have to do is provide their money, and that's something that everybody can do who has money. And we just assume that there is a lot of money in the world, so therefore lenders behave competitively. On the other hand, the entrepreneurs, they have their investment projects and they have their smart ideas, and nobody else can carry out their ideas. So they are kind of a monopolist on their ideas here in this model. Okay, right. That's just an assumption. And of course, we can always discuss what would change if we would switch this assumption, if we would assume that it's actually the lenders who have the bargaining power and the entrepreneur who behaves competitively. That would be exactly the opposite assumption. And like oftentimes, reality is very often somewhere in between. So we just take the one extreme stance here, and it could also be the other way around. That's something that we have to take into account, or that we have to, let's rather say, keep in our heads. It's an assumption where we might say, okay, we want to check that later on. There's one important distinction when we are talking about assumptions, and this distinction is about critical and non-critical assumptions. What's a critical assumption? A critical assumption is one that if you change that assumption, then the complete model does not work anymore. And a non-critical assumption, that's one where if you change that assumption, the whole model just gets a little bit more complicated, but the gist of the model, the most important um, the predictions of the model, they stay exactly the same. So, um, so most of the assumptions on this slide are non-critical assumptions. Of course, we don't know that yet. We will know that these assumptions, that these are non-critical only when we have discussed the model, and then when we've also discussed the alternatives, and then see what would change in an alternative world. So this to think about which assumption is critical, which assumption is not critical, that's a very important task after having seen a model.